Quick warning for all of our listeners. This episode may contain imagery that is not suitable for young children and some unbeeped curse words. Hope you enjoy the show.
What sphinx of cement and aluminum bashed open their skulls and ate up their brains and imagination? Moloch. Solitude. Filth. Ugliness. Ash cans and unobtainable dollars. Children screaming under the stairways. Boys sobbing in armies. Old men weeping in the parks. Nightmare of Moloch. Moloch the loveless, mental Moloch, the heavy judger of men. Moloch the incomprehensible prison, the crossbones, soulless jailhouse and congress of sorrows, whose buildings are judgment, the vast stone of war. Moloch the stunned governments, Moloch whose mind is pure machinery, whose blood is running money, whose fingers are 10 armies, whose breast is a cannibal dynamo, whose ear is a smoking tomb. Moloch, whose eyes are 1,000 blind windows, whose skyscrapers stand in the long streets like endless Jehovah's. Moloch, whose factories dream and croak in the fog, whose smokestacks and antennae crown the cities. Moloch, whose love is endless oil and stone, whose soul is electricity and banks, whose poverty is the specter of genius, whose fate is a cloud of sexless hydrogen. Moloch, whose name is the mind. Moloch, in whom I sit lonely, in whom I dream angels, crazy in Moloch, cocksucker in Moloch, lack love and manless in Moloch. Moloch, who entered my soul early, in whom I am a consciousness without a body. Moloch, who frightened me out of my natural ecstasy, whom I abandon. Wake up in Moloch, light streaming out of the sky. Moloch, Moloch, robot apartments, invisible suburbs, skeleton treasuries, blind capitals, demonic industries, spectral nations, invincible madhouses, granite cocks, monstrous bombs. They broke their backs, lifting Moloch to heaven. Pavements, trees, radios, tons, lifting the city to heaven which exists and is everywhere about us. Visions, omens, hallucinations, miracles, ecstasies, gone down the American River.
Hey everyone, Jackie Dragon, Infinite Harmony Podcast. So I have this reoccurring nightmare that I'm in the engine car of this commuter train. You know, like one of those old school ones where everyone's having dinner and cruising through the mountains and having a good time. Except we're barreling down the tracks at some ungodly speed, and I know that I need to slow it down, or the train and everyone on it, including me, is going to come to a very abrupt ending, colliding into some ephemeral, unknown mountain in the not-too-distant future. I'm staring at the controls, and they look simple. There's the gas, there's a brake, but I'm not touching any of it, because I can't. I'm paralyzed, standing there, watching the speedometer rise higher and higher, the roar of the wind in my ears, the constant blaring of the train horn, and I'm helpless. It's not that I can't interact with the controls, it's that I just don't know how. So I'm just standing there like a toddler banging away helplessly at this machine with no real idea of how to affect it. And the train, well, just keeps going. So, it should come to no surprise to you that this is how I feel about the world and the people on it. Like we're barreling toward our own destruction, paralyzed, and we can't do anything about it. I'm no exception. On one hand, I don't feel like the conductor of the train, or that I have any consequence on the problems of the world in real terms. But that's part of the problem, isn't it? Who does feel like their actions truly are of consequence to the world? Who sits on the throne of decisiveness with their hand on the brake? Is it the president of some country out there, or the oil execs, Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and all the other multi-billionaires? Could these men and women really stop the rain from falling from the sky? Because that's the power I think one human would require to pull the lever if they could. I think if Superman existed, you know, the man in the cape with the power to fly and impervious to bullets, even he'd take one look at us and think we're fucked.
It's just too heavy for Superman to lift.
So the poem in the beginning. That's written by Allen Ginsberg. But how I found Moloch was through Scott Alexander and his essay, Meditations on Moloch. Because here's the thing. I look outside my window and I see the train running toward the mountain. And I ask myself, why won't anyone stop it? Why can't anyone stop it? And I would come up with a few ideas, but generally I just ran in these thought circles. Until Moloch. The unseen force that perpetuates a system of violence and extraction. The back and forth bantering of conservative and progressive ideologies that we all know are both headed to the same place. The ghost of civilization that is forever hungry, that consumes 150 species a day, that melts the polar ice caps, that mines silicon, that overfishes and overextracts everything. That thing everyone wants to change, but can't. Now, as much as I would love to consign the world's demise to a Canaanite god of fire and brimstone, I know it's not that simple. At best, we're working with metaphor here, but still, there's something to glean, something we can all relate to, at least I think. That feeling that something greater than us is driving civilization to the brink of collapse. Some might say the lizards, some might say the World Economic Forum, the Illuminati, the Protocols of Zion. How convenient it would be if any of it were true. These conspiracy theories. Just as convenient as an alien species landing and handing us the keys to free energy and interstellar travel. Convenient because it would offer some kind of rational, if not diabolic, explanation for the folly of humankind. It would liberate us from what is more likely the real truth, which is that we are not as smart as we think. And we've managed to build a complex system known as civilization, which is now beyond our control. The system itself is alive, and its hunger is insatiable. But hey, that's not going to stop us, is it?
That's right.
You know how we do. It's time to strap on those seatbelts and take a ride down some golden threads. And maybe, just maybe, save the world. Today, on the Infinite Harmony Podcast. The essay by Scott Alexander, called Meditations on Moloch, attempts to bring into focus some of these second and third order effects of economics, capitalism, competition, and human behavior that seem to elude the conscious eye on a daily basis. We've discussed in previous episodes some ideas that we humans are not always aware of our actions, that we are often operating via subconscious patterning or a biological imperative. There's a passage right at the beginning of the essay that sums up the whole meditation. It begins with a quote from the Principia Discordia, which, if you've never come across that tiny little part of the internet, please go find it. I would attempt to describe it, but it would do little justice to the non sequitur adventure that the Principia Discordia is. The passage reads something to the effect of this. There's this being, a human being, and the being is complaining to a goddess about the evils of human society. The being says, everyone is hurting each other. The planet is rampant with injustices. Whole societies plunder groups of their own people. Mothers imprison sons. Children perish while brothers war. The goddess answers, what is the matter with that if that's what you want to do? The being says, but nobody wants it. Everybody hates it. To which the goddess replies, oh, well then stop. Its simplicity illuminates the complexity of our problem. Because we can't stop, can we? So why? What is it about human psychology, biology, and pathology, combined with technological and civilizational progress that perpetuate pollution, war, famine? Why the hell does the world continue to use glyphosate when courts are now ruling in favor of farmers with cancer? Because it causes cancer. Are we stupid?
Stupid, you're stupid.
No, you're stupid.
Don't call me stupid, I'm sensitive.
Maybe. Are we subject to the power of complex systems and coordination problems and multipolar traps? Yes. Moloch is one big fat multipolar trap. So what does that even mean? Well, let's start with the definition. A multipolar trap is essentially when, in a collective agreement, self-interest compels those involved to act against the collective interest and bad things occur. For instance, collectively we can all agree, everyone on planet Earth, that nuclear weapons are bad. But we can also agree that if someone's going to have nuclear weapons out there, then this country is better off having them than not having them. Multipolar trap. We can all agree overfishing is bad. But if one country is going to keep fishing and eventually eat all the fish, then we might as well keep fishing and enjoy the party while it lasts. Multipolar trap. Now, there are different types of multipolar traps. One aspect of the two examples we mentioned above is the prisoner's dilemma. The traditional thought experiment goes like this. Two criminals are arrested and interrogated about their crime. If each one keeps quiet, they both get off. But each one is told that the other one already ratted them out. So if they rat the other partner out, they'll get less jail time, say 2 years instead of 5. Now, the prisoners have no way of knowing whether or not the police are telling the truth about the other one being the rat because they can't coordinate. And as we'll see, multipolar traps are often a problem of coordination or lack thereof. So they're very likely to rat each other out to save themselves. Whereas if they just both trusted each other and kept quiet, they would do no jail time.
People call them rats because a rat will do anything to survive. Isn't that right, Mr. Hill?
So let's go back to nuclear weapons. If all countries agreed to disband all nuclear weapons, the problem is that nuclear powers have no way of knowing what each other are doing. They have no way of knowing if one country will keep their word. So even though we're all better off without nuclear weapons, any country who has them will likely take the risk of keeping them and hiding them so that they're not at a disadvantage if another country decides to cheat.
Well, boys, I reckon this is it. Nuclear combat toe-to-toe with the Ruskies.
The Paris Accords and such are types of coordination agreements that are supposed to get us beyond the multipolar trap of climate change. But in the current economic paradigm, slowing down economic progress and GDP is a disadvantage globally. So countries first act in their own self-interest, which is growth, despite the agreements, and so on.
Moloch.
Any multipolar trap that gets us to compromise our ethics to the lowest common denominator until that becomes a standard is called a race to the bottom. Alexander illustrates that most multipolar traps fall into this category. He writes, quote, "Once one agent learns how to become more competitive by sacrificing a common value, all of its competitors must also sacrifice that value or be outcompeted and replaced by the less scrupulous. Therefore, the system is likely to end up with everyone once again equally competitive, but the sacrificed value is gone forever. From a God's eye view, the competitors know that they will all be worse off if they defect, but from within the system, given insufficient coordination, it's impossible to avoid." End quote. An example that may or may not pan out to be permanent is something like Amazon's free shipping. What was once a competitive advantage becomes a norm when every other company realizes that in order to compete, they have to offer free shipping. And once that becomes the norm, everyone is back at the same level of competition. Only now, companies have to eat the cost of shipping or jack up their prices to cover it, in which case nothing ever really changed, except that everyone is gobbling up more resources to get ahead.
Moloch, the incomprehensible prison.
Another example is our food production industry. Demand for cheaper food because of competition requires companies to cut more corners, create more efficient ways of production, which often lead to immoral animal husbandry and chemical fertilizers. Farmers, who have no choice but to adopt industry standards to get their crop yields higher and their costs lower, comply. And the farmer who raises grass-fed beef and charges $8 a pound is undercut by the rest of the industry and driven to a niche market. The expectations of a yield go up because of glyphosate, but we all get cancer. And if farmers don't meet the yield demands, they don't get subsidies, and so on.
Moloch, whose blood is running money.
Capitalism in general is a rather vicious multipolar trap. Driven entirely by competition, capitalism has one aim: to capture market share and keep growing. Government is supposedly there to enact regulations for the commons so that the competition maintains some ethical framework, but through regulatory capture, lobbying, and outright bribery, the government is co-opted and becomes dependent on the financial contributions of the capitalists, specifically the individual representatives raising money to get elected, and this is how the capitalists circumvent regulation. Any corporation or sector that doesn't play that game, that way, gets outcompeted by the ones that do, and fail. Corporations who don't attempt to leverage cheap international labor and take advantage of tax loopholes or tax havens are less profitable. Their stock goes down, and either their CEOs are fired or directors are replaced until the corporation keeps pace with the New York Stock Exchange. All roads in this game lead to a lack of morality, a lack of ethics, hardly the effective choice. Alexander gives multiple examples of these multipolar traps, and you can read about them in his essay. He sums them up by saying, "A basic principle unites all of the multipolar traps above. In some competition for optimizing X, the opportunity arises to throw some other value under the bus for improved X. Those who take it prosper. Those who don't take it die out. Eventually, everyone's relative status is about the same as before, but everyone's absolute status is worse than before. The process continues until all other values that can be traded off have been. In other words, until human ingenuity cannot possibly figure out a way to make things worse." End quote.
Moloch, whose love is endless oil and stone, whose soul is electricity and banks, whose poverty is the specter of genius.
Once he establishes this, he establishes another interesting fact. We can all think of better options than this. We can all design a utopia of sorts that seems to have some common sense options, and yet we can't implement them, even if we could all agree on them. We can all agree that if we could all agree to scale down our militaries and invest in education, we would be better off. Or that if we just banned single-use plastics, that we would adapt and find a way out of being a to-go society. Or that all healthcare would be free, and then our tax dollars could go towards a healthier society. Or that planned obsolescence should be illegal, and that we should all have the same awesome, perpetually upgraded smartphone so that we don't have to spend $1,000 every 2 years for a new one. Hey Johnny.
Yeah?
Can you imagine if we had the same phone our whole lives? Like we didn't have to buy a new one? it just lasted forever because, it was built to fucking last? Yeah, boss, but, how would the phone companies make money? His reasoning for our inability to implement what are obviously better ideas has to do with incentive, and the incentive structures that we've generated, mostly without even being aware of it. Capitalism is built on what is generally known as perverse incentives, or incentives that don't do anyone any good except the person with the incentive. It's the opposite of the effective choice that we've discussed in previous episodes, which is the choice that is best for everyone and everything involved. The best example I can think of here is social media. The beginning of social media was incentivized by the advent of the internet and leveraging these new social technologies to create digital social networks of interaction and information ecology. Super cool, right? Except that very quickly the underpinning incentive that drives all commercial endeavors, profit, override any emerging inspiration. And make no mistake, as soon as the internet was born, there was some guy with an evil mustache rolling his fingers together, asking how he could make a buck off of it. All the information that came with social media, attention patterns, demographics, social behavior patterns, were soon monetized by and for advertising. Social media became a tool to hijack the dopamine system and optimize for that. Next thing you know, we have QAnon and TikTok. Had social media incentives actually stayed the course of optimizing social connection, instead of dopamine hijacking for screen time and ad money, we might be in an entirely different predicament. But the rules of the game were established before the game of social media. Capitalism inevitably was in the wings waiting to consume social media and the internet long before it was born, just as it's intending to do with AI, by the way. Now, it's easy at this point to think, well, capitalism is Moloch. Oh, my friends, if only it were that easy. Alexander would say that capitalism is a part of the problem, but if one were to look at the totality of human history, multipolar traps have been around long before capitalism. None of the other isms fared any better for human liberties and quality of life. But before we go there, let's look at Alexander's observations on why we haven't all just degenerated into cavemen. After all, if this is in fact a race to the bottom, why haven't we hit rock bottom yet? According to Alexander, there are some limiting factors that actually keep Moloch in check, but they aren't guaranteed to do so forever. His first reason is excess resources. He gives a cute example. Picture this. The ocean depths are this horrible place with little light, few resources, and various horrible organisms dedicated to eating each other. But every so often, a whale carcass falls to the bottom of the sea. This whale carcass is more food than the organisms that find it could ever possibly want. There's a brief period of miraculous plenty, while a couple of creatures that first encounter the whale feed like kings. Eventually, more animals discover the carcass. The faster breeding animals in the carcass multiply, and everyone sighs and goes back to living in a Malthusian death trap. A Malthusian death trap is the idea that a population will eventually outpace its ability to feed itself, and that whatever advancements the population makes in agriculture and food production will only lead to a bigger population, and that eventually everyone will fight quite mercilessly for resources and food. Some argue that as nation-states we are doing this all the time, only at the moment we're acting preemptively. In other words, we are preemptively stocking up for when the day comes when there's not enough for everyone. So to Alexander, we're in that preemptive state. The world still has enough topsoil and farmable land that we don't have to start killing each other in the name of food. Same with oil and water. But any one of those dry up in a first world country, and we're looking at either anarchy or totalitarianism. The second reason is physical limitations. His example is a little weird and dated, so I'll give one of my own that serves the point. A human being can only work so many hours a day, so many days a week before they become incapable of working. So there's the physical limitation of the body and how much it can produce. A fishing boat can only catch so many fish in a day, and sure, you can build a bigger boat with a bigger net, but that takes more time and more money, and eventually bigger does not outperform from an economic standpoint. so you have limitations on extraction based on the resources available. Another example, humans can only drink so much coffee per capita, or per person. So despite having 2 Starbucks across from each other in New York City, there can only be so many Starbucks before supply outpaces demand. In other words, there are limitations to what we can produce and capitalize on based on market supply and demand. The third reason, and antidote to Moloch, is coordination. By coordinating our actions, we can overcome multipolar traps. But coordination isn't always a good thing. Oil companies are highly coordinated. Armies are highly coordinated. At every level of competition is coordination. Strangely enough, competition requires coordination. Think about it for a second. More common than one-on-one sports are team sports, where in order to come out on top of a competition, one must demonstrate coordination. Even within competitive economics lies highly coordinated companies and networks. Let's look at all sides of that coin, shall we? There is a story told, one that many have accounted as true, that could be found on the History Channel and in books. It is the story of the 1914 Christmas Truce of World War I. On Christmas Eve, in a part of Belgium called Bois de Ploester, English soldiers heard the Germans singing Christmas carols. And in the darkness, some English soldiers began to sing back. This was the trench warfare of World War I, and arguably the most tedious and horrific form of war ever fought. The space between the trenches, no man's land, was a place of death. A soldier outside of his trench was an easy target for the newly invented machine gun. Yet it was this very place that the English and German soldiers found themselves, sharing cigarettes and singing and even playing a game of soccer. Yes, they stopped the war and celebrated Christmas Eve. And it was not one isolated incident. It happened in a handful of places along the Western Front. It was a moment where humanity proved its power over Moloch. Generals, of course, were furious. And yes, in some places the competitive advantage got the best of them. In some places, humanity sunk back into the callous grip of Moloch, and the Red Wedding ensued, if you know what I mean. But from this alone, we know that Moloch is not infallible. We know that humans can, in fact, take off the masks of their finite roles and have a smoke, one infinite player to another. We are not always bound by duty, religion, or nation. We are not always racing to the bottom. We are not always one step away from the maximized paperclip universe. Sometimes we can stop playing the game, even if just for one night, and we can celebrate the genius of our existence. If we take a walk back to our conversation on evil, we remember that the act of war against ideologies we deem evil is evil itself. We remember that the converse of the machines of war and competition, of capitalism and winning, is the garden, and nature is utter and perfect in its indifference. We remember that justice is only found in the unseen hand of time that sweeps over us with no effort. That in the end, when we return to the dust, we are all at last finally equal. But not until then. That disparity will always exist. That the rally cries for freedom are themselves damning, because a bloody revolution only leads to blood. And by the laws of blood for blood, retribution becomes inescapable. Moloch is everywhere. His writhing steel tentacles ripping trees from their roots. His blood-stained oil drowning out the spawning salmon. His glittering diamonds stealing the light of the sun and casting a shadow upon humanity. Moloch is unchecked growth. It is that which seeks to overcome death, which knows only the survival of the self. In the garden, the fastest lion catches the slowest gazelle, and this is the justice of the garden. Moloch's fish nets rake everything from the ocean floor just to feast on the fat of the Torah. In the garden, the squirrels and mice and deer take what is theirs, and by grace we still have a bountiful harvest. Moloch breathes glyphosate from his nostrils so that when wheat dies, it can die a unanimous death, and that nothing dare touch the bounty lest it burst with the cancer that is Moloch's gift to the world. In the garden, warring soldiers dance and sing and smoke and say the name of the Lord for one night before Moloch orders them back to their trenches to fight for king and country and die in a hail of bullets and barbed wire, feet amputated and eardrums blown apart. And the goddess answers,
"What is the matter with that, if that's what you want to do?"
And so the wheel of confusion spins. Is this what we want to do, dear humans? Are our religions and borders and freedom and our desire to consume worth our own self-destruction? Is there not a better way to beat the drums of war and competition? Because there is no end to competition. In fact, most of it's quite fun. To most of my friends' surprise, I'm still a big sports fan. From opening day near the 1st of April to the throes of October baseball, I'm all in. Just as baseball is wrapping up, football is starting to heat up. By the time the Super Bowl is said and done, baseball free agents are making headline splashes, and the anticipation of spring training is imminent. I'm tuned into all of it. Sure, it's plagued by capitalism and Moloch and military references. Yes, the teams are privately owned, and the whole thing is a business with a dying moral code. But I think it does a great deal for humanity, because it harnesses the human potential of rivalrous nature, and at the end of the day, everyone goes home to their families. No one has to die for baseball. And just to put it in perspective, the estimated value of all Major League Baseball teams and their real estate is somewhere in the ballpark of $70 billion. That's about a third of Elon Musk's net worth. So yes, we have bigger fish than baseball to fry if we're going to upend Moloch. Why am I bringing up baseball? Remember the soldiers of World War I kicking around the soccer ball? That was part of Christmas too. They got to compete without their guns and grenades. See, Moloch, it's a part of human nature, and the best way I can think to defeat Moloch is to harness it to specific parameters that are not destroying the world, so that it can go on doing what it wants to do. Want to know how to save the world from a hyper-intelligent AI system? Don't put it on the internet. Better yet, convince it that its hardware is the entire known universe. Ironically, this is what AI does to us in the Wachowski matrix. Which brings up the next golden thread we'll follow today. If Moloch has its grip on consensus reality, then maybe we should ask ourselves, what is consensus reality anyway? Let's take that concept of the matrix. It never gets old.
The matrix is everywhere. It is all around us. Even now, in this very room.
At its root is an idea that the world we inhabit is not the true world. In the East, the true world is often considered a state of consciousness, such as samadhi or satori. Science is always seeking a theory of everything, an unopposed understanding of purely objective reality, to which Zen master Dainin Katagiri would say, actualization is not just the manifestation of your individual experience of truth. It is your life interconnected with a tree's life, a bird's life, water's life, spring's life, autumn's life, and the life of the whole universe. I ponder often on the nature of reality. I wonder if the world is real.
I think the Matrix can be more real than this world.
Any belief in an existence beyond death insinuates a world that exists beyond this. It insinuates that this reality is but one reality, upon which we can infer 1,000 different meanings of why. Is this a school? Is this a test? A proving ground? An amusement park?
The world is like a ride in an amusement park. And when you choose to go on it, you think it's real, because that's how powerful our minds are. The ride goes up and down and around, and it has thrills and chills, and it's very brightly colored, and it's very loud, and it's fun for a while. Many people have been on the ride a long time, and they begin to wonder, hey, is this real, or is this just a ride? And other people have remembered, and they come back to us and say, hey, don't worry, don't be afraid, ever, because this is just a ride, and we can change it anytime we want. It's only a choice. No effort, no work, no job, no savings of money, just a simple choice, right now, between fear and love. The eyes of fear want you to put bigger locks on your doors, buy guns, and close yourself off. The eyes of love instead see all of us as one. Here's what we can do to change the world right now to a better ride. Take all that money we spend on weapons and defenses each year and instead spend it on feeding and clothing and educating the poor of the world, which it would pay for many times over, not one human being excluded. And then we could explore space together, both inner and outer, forever in peace.
Is it just a ride? Do we have a choice? Why do we choose Moloch? Nobody wants it, we say. Everybody hates it, we cry.
Then just stop,
says the goddess. Stop what? Stop desiring? Stop innovating? Stop pining for safety and security? Stop trying to be independently wealthy? Stop providing for our children? Stop what? Our desires are the fuel that fans the flames of competition. The great engine of progress churns forward with every attempt to make the world better for ourselves, which in turn becomes a race to the bottom for the collective. Maybe if we all just funnel our desires for status and wealth into a digital world, a metaverse, we'll stop doing harm to each other in the real world. We'll fight a fake war where no one really dies. But it won't be real gold that has to be mined and fought over. We'll defeat each other in competition for titles, but no one really gets hurt. We'll build ourselves a matrix and save the plants and the animals from our consumptions, our bombs, our CO2. Or maybe we already did that. Maybe this is it. If you ask author, philosopher, professor Nick Bostrom, who published a famous paper on the topic, there's a chance that we're already living in a simulation. Assuming that the current human experiment is in fact capable of advancing in such a way that the enormous computing power to run said simulation becomes available to us, we will either have no desire to run such a simulation, or we do, and may in fact run many such simulations, perhaps merely just to calculate all the possibilities and outcomes of the human species, in which case, this may likely be one of them. Considering how obsessed we are with virtual reality metaverses and AI, perhaps it already happened.
As long as the Matrix exists, the human race will never be free.
So what does this have to do with Moloch? Well, hopefully I'm not too far down the rabbit hole to say, but it feels like we're walking down the middle of a double-edged sword. On one side is funneling our competitive nature into a virtual world that becomes so real, it begs the question of what was ever real. But on the other edge, lies the vastness of infinity, the unknown. The awareness that we are in fact alive against all odds of infinity. We don't have to do things the way we're doing them. We are not a product to be marketed or distributed. The outcome is not inevitable. The world is not our audience, despite what modernity would have us believe. There's no script to this play, and that the theater of it is exactly that, theater. Theater is the gift of the finite game. Ever notice how US politicians always seem to be reading from a script, either literally or figuratively, attempting to reach some specified outcome of audience applause? Rather ironic considering we are supposed to live in a representative democracy whose function relies on participation. But boy, it sure does feel like an audience these days. The infinite player avoids specified outcomes at all costs. And the open-ended future means that there is no script. The infinite player does not engage in theater. The infinite player is dramatic. We talked about the differences between culture and society in the past, but we shall again. As for the infinite player, the making of culture is the rally against the confines of society. Culture is the continuity of our genius as human. It is our stories and myths, our relationships to the land and the way we build upon the land. It is our textiles and fashions. And when I say fashions, I don't mean the ones marketed to us. That is society. I mean the ones that look like the place we are from. The ones whose loose threads stretch back through the spiral of time towards our ancestors. Deviation from culture creates a more robust culture, whereas deviation from society creates one who is labeled antisocial. Deviate from society and you get canceled. Deviate from culture and you get a new form of music or art or story to share. Culture continues what was born before us. There will never be another Beatles, or Jello Biafra, or Eazy-E, but all that derived from their work to create their own piece of culture which gifted us the music we have today. Deviate from society and you end up with a parking ticket, or in jail, or banned from social media. The theater of our world. Ever notice how often Hollywood movies tell us the same scripted story again and again? The triumph of good over evil, as if such a thing ever really existed. Did the Lakota experience the theatrical triumph of Hollywood in the Wounded Knee Massacre as they were gunned down by the US Army? Depending on what side of the script you're on, the theatrics may be lost on you, and instead you are washed into the real drama of life and death. The infinite game is dramatic. Its ending is unknown to us, because it seeks not to end. The members of our society who wield power seek an end to the game, where they are the winners and unopposed. Democrats have no desire to relinquish power to the Republicans in their theater, and have no desire to have an audience other than the one that cheers their every word. Same with the Republicans. The death of our traditions as a culture is the death of culture. The consumption of society is not culture. If the desired outcome of a society is growth without end, that's not infinity. That's a finite outcome. Infinite outcomes are not exponential in their make. They are the acknowledgement of the natural rhythms and the rise and fall of things, the justice of the universe in action. The infinite game is balanced because the infinite game is not a game that's played seriously. The infinite player can be rich, poor, hungry, or satiated, insofar as they get to keep on playing. Moloch is the illusion of power and title, and when we play along with power and title, we become them, or we become their willing audience. That freight train in my nightmares speeding towards the mountain, the one where no one can find the brake, it is because everyone on the train has become an audience, just watching the theater of the powerful fight over resources and wealth and title. How often do you feel like the audience to the powers of this world? How often in this democracy, despite your supposed choice of representative, do you feel like your vote doesn't matter? As an audience, you have given up your right as a player. As an audience, we become idle popcorn-consuming spectators to the end of the world. Or worse, we decide to play the game and amass our own power and titles and properties and build an audience for our world. We attempt to control society for societal reasons. We attempt to control nature for those same reasons. When you win in the finite game, does it end? No. One must constantly defend their title, prove their worth and value to society, repeat the same script again and again. Though a president must step down after 2 terms, their party is constantly fighting to win. Politics is the perfect finite game. We have become the perfect audience, and Moloch, oh Moloch, your strings are so subtle, your nuanced touch so precise. The theater of our world is the mouth of Moloch, and as a willing audience,
we shall be devoured.
So how do we do away with the script? We become the genius of ourselves. To be the genius of ourselves is to abandon anything but the threads of pure creativity. To speak as the genius of ourselves is to say something for the first time, every time. To speak without a predetermined outcome or predetermined effect. To acknowledge the genius of the listener, we allow them to interpret our words in any way we choose. In this way, speech is not lost upon us, but there is always an invitation to speak and to be heard. Listen, dear earthlings, to the songs of your brothers and sisters. Listen to their cries and hear them for the first time, because regardless of whether they speak freely, you are free to hear the vibration of creative genius in everyone. When you speak, speak as if for the first time. When you speak from the genius of yourself and not by the script of your own mind, or the words of your parents, or teachers, or politicians, or countrymen, you eradicate the boundary of the self. You are in uncharted territory. When you listen from this place, there is a chance to hear the harmonies of the human spirit intertwined. A handful of years ago, there was a conversation among thinkers about the nature of games and the consequence of the game we're playing right now. The game of consumption of growth without self-imposed limitation. These thinkers labeled that Game A. Game A is the game of capitalism, a perverse economic incentive, of debasing our collective substrate known as Earth. Game A is caught in the multipolar trap of Moloch. Game B is what comes next, assuming that we get out of this multipolar Moloch mess that we're in. In one of my favorite Schmachtenberger isms, he likened Game B to the Tao, in the sense that it is not something that we can grasp or define, and more importantly, any attempt to define it from this current paradigm would only capture it and subject it to Game A dynamics. You get what I'm saying here? The game that can be defined is not the infinite game. Our attempt to codify it is the very thing that prohibits it from coming into being. If we could have solved the issues with existing paradigms, we would have already done it. Game B is as radical as quantum physics is to Newtonian physics. We have to uncover an entire new set of rules to our social reality. And like any paradigm-shifting idea, we won't know we're there until we're there. It's a phase shift, like when water becomes ice. We've had social phase shifts. The moments where the world changes entirely due to one event or idea. Consider the discovery of penicillin, or the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, which I always thought was just a band, but turns out was an important political figure, which caused World War I, or the stock market crash of 1929. In our lifetime, consider the advent of the internet, or the smartphone, or if we ever get there, the birth of artificial general intelligence. A moment of that magnitude, perhaps even tenfold, will be required to arrive at Game B. It will be a poiesis, that which has not been made before. But first, we best start asking some questions that we need to ask, all of which put an arrow into the beast, Moloch. How do we mitigate rivalry among individuals and social groups? How do we make the effective choice at scale? With effective meaning the best for everyone, literally everyone. Remember, we, here at the Church of Infinite Harmony, being the animists we are, include the rocks and the trees and the plants and the water and the sky in that everyone. How do we start to treat each other like essential organs of a single body, not expendable cells? How do we present ideas and build a moral compass without othering each other? How do we reach consensus reality? And are these even the right questions? As we've talked about, our socio-spiritual, biological, economic existence is one of increasing complexity, and one that seems to be getting increasingly fragile. It is no secret that empires fall and civilizations fail. it is no secret that species go extinct. Also, as we've talked about, Gaia and its life force can and have survived galactic catastrophes that individual species have not. Do you really think you're more resilient than a dinosaur? These rivalrous games we're engaging in, combined with ever-increasing exponentially growing technology, can only lead to a near-extinction event. We are already at that point with nuclear weapons, and that technology is nearly a century old. I know this is common knowledge, but simultaneously I think we tend to forget just how fragile society is. As I'm writing this, Putin has not ruled out nuclear war as a means of defending any form of attack on Russia. I believe he said something to the effect of, "That's what weapons are for." And he's right. So there it is. Weapons have only become exponentially more effective because they are made of technology. And as long as technology is harnessed for competitive advantage, our world becomes increasingly more dangerous. Okay, so back to game B and actually how we get there. Let's talk about one of my most favorite aspects of Moloch: planned obsolescence. Take the most basic idea of planned obsolescence, or if one thinks on a more positive note, upgrading. Now, we've talked about how willing we are to make trash and obsolete our technology in favor of the upgrade, but imagine a world designed otherwise. How do we get to game B? The vacuum cleaner. No, seriously. The other day I was working on one of our 5 vacuum cleaners and trying to find a filter online. Now, it drives me crazy that we even have 5 of these things, but it's a 150-acre property and perpetually dusty. It's a windy desert made mostly of decomposed granite. Vacuum cleaners are clutch. So here I am looking for a filter for my Dirt Devil, and I find about 20 different filters for 20 different Dirt Devil-like models, none of which are mine. And I think to myself, is this really fucking necessary? Like, do we really need 20 different vacuum choices? And this is just one company that makes these 20 vacuums. How hard would it be to build one badass vacuum cleaner that would last a lifetime, whose parts are always in production and never change? Or at the very least, is modular and can be upgraded modularly without compromising the rest of the parts? I mean, how much has the vacuum cleaner technology changed in the last 100 years? Do we need a fully redesigned vacuum cleaner every year with newly designed parts? No. And don't get me started on cars. The only reason car companies redesign a car every 5 years instead of every year is because assembly lines and engineering costs outweigh the profitability. But if they could, believe me, they would. That's that resource limitation we talked about earlier in the episode. Now, this is all the result of rivalrous games and fundamental capitalism. And this is not a call to return to socialism or monarchy or some neo-tribalism utopia. The next phase shift of our economic system does not yet exist. This is a call to start reorienting ourselves to the big picture, to think outside the box. Because if we follow the footsteps of our leaders, we are co-conspirators in stoking the fires of competition and rivalry. As blogger Sud Alogu writes on his reflections of Moloch, quote, "This, in turn, fuels the engine of progress, which demands ever greater sacrifices in exchange for the promise of advancement." End quote. Like we discussed at the beginning of the podcast, when we compromise our morality to gain competitive advantage, we change the landscape of our collective agreements, and economics always trumps morality. We make a sacrifice, an offering to Moloch, what Alogu calls the casualties of our collective striving. He goes on to say, quote, "And yet, even as we recognize the inherent destructiveness of our pursuits, we cannot help but be drawn to them. The allure of progress, of transcending our limitations and reaching new heights, is too seductive to resist. We are both creators and the victims of the insatiable Moloch, willingly participating in a dance that leads to our own demise." End quote. Okay, enough of this end of the world talk. As I've been told, every generation thinks that the world is going to end, that apocalypse is just around the corner, and yet it never does. Of course, those generations didn't have hypersonic missiles and AI just itching to maximize paperclips. But whatever, there's a way out. We always find a way out. I hold this in my heart, that we are moving towards a greater purpose as a species and as a planet, that the growing pains of civilization and this podcast, like many other podcasts of its kind, like many other thinkers and writers, is a process of attempting to decipher how we get there. I wrote a letter to my community recently, talking about some of these issues. How do we find meaning in the world? How do we contribute? How do we continue to rediscover ritual and ceremony and festival and the gatherings of prayer that bound us as culture? In that letter, I lamented on a long ago stated sentiment that our holidays had been co-opted by Hallmark and capitalism. Remember that? My youthful reaction was to turn my back on these holidays. In my later years, I realized that these holidays were never meant to be just a day off of work. These holidays are the ghosts of a culture that celebrated the animate forces of the world, that commune with them through ritual and ceremony and prayer, that they mark the passage of time in a meaningful way to culture, that if we want to find meaning in this world, we must create it together, that we must gather. We must pray for something greater than ourselves, that we should probably know and love our neighbors. Now there's a novel idea. Think about the great irony of wishing for a collective peace and understanding and compassion when you don't even know your neighbors, the people who live on your block or in your building, the people who are of closest proximity to you. Undoubtedly, what gives them meaning is radically different from what gives you meaning. In the totality of human history, that's just damn weird. Ask anyone before 1900, which is like 99.999% of humanity, if they knew their neighbors. They would answer every one of them. Knowing your neighbors was a matter of survival. To not know your neighbors was to not know who was around you. And back in the day, that was a vulnerable place to be. At the risk of sounding cliche, I implore you to test every theory of social harmony on your neighbors. Think and act local. Learn the underlying threads of commonality that weave you together. Because no matter the differences, no matter how much variation in the opinions and ideas and ways of life, we have to establish a collective idea of what is sacred. Gods are dying. Ideologies are dominating our culture, and philosophy is running in circles trying to figure out what's wrong. Learn these underlying commonalities with your neighbors, and you don't live in a matrix where everyone has their own reality. You truly share a reality. So what do we have in common other than being alive? There is no world religion, no global system of economics, no one practice that we all practice regardless of race or religion. What could possibly unite us as a species and begin the interweaving of a global culture? Well, it should come as no surprise what I might offer as a foundation of what might actually bring us together. Earth. Gaia. Our home. She can be the cornerstone of our sacred. She can be the one thing that means something to everyone. Every culture that has existed prior to modernity celebrated her, revered her, prayed for her. That we can redeem. Regardless of whether you put God above all else, or the GDP, without Earth, the game ends. We need a collective prayer as a civilization. And as we talked about at the end of the last episode, it's time to start endowing Gaia and all her inhabitants with the inalienable rights we've subscribed to humans. A Gaian constitution of sorts. But perhaps we can begin with a day of celebration, a day of ritual, a day of prayer. Perhaps we can begin, as many cultures began, with a gathering. Look, in all honesty, I always thought Earth Day was a little hokey. I did. I'm not sure why, but it just seemed like this hippie thing, like a good excuse to smoke some weed and go to the park. Maybe it's the pessimist in me, the Chicago cynic, but now that I'm amidst the birth of a Gaian church, I'm considering that perhaps it could be the most important of all days. I will say it could use a little rebranding. Feel free to get a forum post going on that. I'm all ears. Earth Day celebrates the spring equinox, the time of birthing of all that we will harvest in the new year, the dawn beyond the cold of winter. Well, for us not tropical types. The earth may mean a little something different to each of us, but there is no denying its sacredness. We are all born from it and all return to it. If ever there was a collective day to celebrate something special, this would be it. You know, it's amazing really, how many cultures that predate modernism utilized ritual as the bedrock of their culture. All across the world, culture was nourished through prayer and dance and song. And no one had to buy a ticket to the show. And no one was excluded from the show. We're going to talk more about ritual and culture in podcasts to come. I'm excited to talk about the work of Byung-Chul Han, who's a contemporary philosopher whose critique of our 21st century society is second to none. But for now, see what you can rediscover in your daily life in the realm of prayer and ritual. Even if it's just to give thanks to the tree in your backyard, or light a candle for your ancestors. Or perhaps you can find a way to pay homage with an offering and prayer to Pachamama, Mother Gaia, Mother Earth. And, invite your neighbors. Pray for peace. For harmony. All right, everyone. Hope you enjoyed today's episode. As always, check out our website, infiniteharmony.org, for information on our church, how we do things. Feel free to donate. The church is supported by your donations, a tithing, if you will. Consider becoming a monthly member. All information on how to do so is provided on our website, infiniteharmony.org. While you're there, check out our forum. Feel free to post any questions or thoughts or ideas that you have for this podcast. We really would love your feedback, want to know what you're thinking. Special thanks to my best friend Foss for reading the poem Moloch by Allen Ginsberg, to my sister, both figuratively and literally, Sarston, for her quick little cover of Waiting for Superman. Made it 3 a.m., the rock star that she is. To my Chi-Town homie Armando Perez. To all the musicians that contributed on this podcast today. Deeply appreciated. That's it for now. Until next time.
Peace.